So that distinction actually comes out of the Indian Act. So then there are Métis and Inuit. So 3 different Aboriginal people under the Constitution. But there's very little information about how these administrative categories are defined. So who is First Nations, who is Métis, who is Inuit, seems simple when you first start looking at it. And then as you get more and more into it, you realize it's extremely complex. It's changed a lot over time. It's probably going to change in the future. And it doesn't really tell us much about people themselves. It just tells us how the state administers us differently. The distinction between these categories is not that we're such different peoples. I mean, we are. There's an incredible variety between all original peoples and their societies. So we have so much diversity here. But, you know, to say that like there's a difference, such a distinct difference between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit is sort of hiding the fact that the difference there is simply how the state has related to us. So these definitions, they're not about DNA or blood quantum, you know, but family ties matter. They're not even about phenotype, although sometimes that gets thrown in there. They're confusing, and they're all about how the state wants to relate to us or doesn't want to relate to us. So all I'm saying with this is go out into the world with a question mark over your head when it comes to Indigenous identity, because it's really, really confusing. I had to go to law school before I could really understand status and explain it well to other people, and it's constantly evolving. So these administrative categories are super confusing and yet really important. They play a huge part in our lives. So the other thing we need to talk about is sort of the settler colonialism. You know, what is it? How is it different than colonialism in general? So we think of the colonial period, and this map is a really good sort of depiction of that. We're like, yeah, the colonial period sort of ended in the early 20th century. But settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism, and it functions through the replacement of Indigenous populations with an invasive settler society. And that society over time develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty. So they become a new people on stolen lands. And so that identity that Canadians have is not linked anymore to Britain. I mean, there's some holdovers there, right? But in the main, folks living in Canada, folks living in the United States, New Zealanders, folks in Australia, like they see themselves as a new people. And so that identity, they're not thinking about, you know, the mother country anymore or sending resources there. They have now created a new settler society on these lands. And so a lot gets tied up into that identity and that feeling of like who you are. And that's why this discussion tends to be really painful for a lot of people. People don't want to be called settlers because they want to say things like, well, I didn't colonize these lands, you know, like I wasn't even here. So how can you blame it on me? So the first thing that we need to talk about is the fact that, as Patrick Wolf said, settler colonialism is a structure. It's not an event. It's not the thing that you did, or even the thing that your parents or great-grandparents did. It's not like a thing, a choice, right? It's not just the action itself. It's an entire structure that has been set up, meaning there's no beginning or end. The erasure of Indigenous peoples is an ongoing requirement of settler colonialism, with the goal of eliminating all challenges to settler colonial sovereignty, so settlers who have formed a distinct identity can belong here and have that moral claim. So when I talk about settler colonialism being an event, the way that like a structure, not an event, I want you to think about like the metaphor of a house. Right? So you can move into the house, you can knock down walls, you can paint it, you can decorate it, you can stick the cousin you don't like in the broom closet, you can take, you know, the main bedroom, you can do all of this stuff to it, but the structure itself remains, right? And it really impacts what you're able to do in that space. So it doesn't matter if you've been here for generations, it doesn't matter if you're coming here tomorrow, you're stepping into a structure that has already been built, that is foundationally built on the erasure of Indigenous peoples and on claiming Indigenous lands, resources, and sovereignty over Indigenous peoples. So once you know that that's one of the structures that you're stepping into, because that structure is also comprised of white supremacy and anti-Blackness and a lot of other sort of hierarchies and oppressions, you can come in and start to see the way that structure is built and not think about it as something in you. It's not you that we're talking about. We're talking about the structure, and how you relate to that structure is the important part. So another myth is that Canada has a legal and moral right to exist simply because it does. It's already here, it's de facto, so doesn't that make it right? Sorry, desperately need my caffeine. So Canada sees itself this way, right? Outside of Quebec. Notice they're just like, yeah, Quebec, whatever. But obviously this is sort of the view. It's either one country or we have a couple of different polities there, but there's no Canada-wide treaty giving this country a right to exist, much less impose its legal orders and claims on all of the resources and peoples that were here as its own to govern, use, and unilaterally profit from, right? So this idea of a moral claim is rooted in a lot of problematic stuff that Canada has recently overtly repudiated. So the doctrine of discovery, terra nullius, this idea that papal bulls from the 15th century gave Europeans the right to seize lands and peoples. Canada even legally no longer says that that's a justification. But again, question mark, so what is the justification? So Canada didn't discover, conquer Indigenous peoples. So that's not me writing on there. Somebody else has some power there. And yeah, it just, there's not like a unilateral, like a uniform claim to any of these spaces. So not even the Canadian courts agree with sort of the mainstream Canadian claim to all the lands. Like if we consider that treaties then, treaties that specifically talk about ceding and releasing and surrendering land, so that's like the historic treaties here, that doesn't even cover all of Canada. There's still vast swaths of land that Canada really can't account for. And, the Delgamuukw case in British Columbia really highlighted that there are big chunks of land that are not under treaty. So if we're going to use treaty as a basis for the sort of legal and moral right to exist, then what happens in areas that are not treaty, right? Okay, so another myth is that Canadian taxpayers support Indigenous peoples with their taxes, right? Like that we're a burden on the Canadian state. And of course, that claim is based on the idea that Canada owns everything and has a right to it in perpetuity. And the wealth of this nation has always been derived by exploiting natural resources that can only be accessed, controlled, made a profit off of by displacing Indigenous peoples from our lands and claiming those resources for the nation state. But do you think that we chose to be excluded from all this wealth? Like, however bad things are right now, and they are really, really bad for a lot of people, Canada is a wealthy nation. So does it make sense that Indigenous peoples would just say, no, we don't want that. We don't want to be included in that wealth? Because regardless of what position you take, like how you think Canada has a moral claim, none of it makes sense. If Canada stole these lands, then they have to return them. That includes the resources. If Canada claims to have made fair treaties with willing partners, then how is it possible that such unequal agreements could have ever taken place? How could we be, as treaty partners, then excluded from this wealth? So this is just a sense of some of the natural resources that are exported and that Canada derives its wealth from. And this is from 2020. But I really think it's interesting that real estate and leasing is one of the largest sectors of our economy right now. Literally the land, right? The land and how much value you ascribe to the land is how Canada maintains a lot of its wealth. And we're all feeling it, right? Like how many folks out there are ever going to be able to buy a house or ever going to, even be able to have affordable rent. So this sort of weird economy that we have is like literally based on occupying and claiming the land and then deriving wealth from it. So it's intensely problematic. All right, let's talk about moves to innocence. So Canada, one of the myths of sort of like Canada's beginning is that it's a nation of immigrants and therefore, nobody should have more of a claim than anybody else. And this does get applied to Indigenous peoples in really weird ways. So it's indisputable that Indigenous peoples have existed on these lands for thousands of years before Europeans came. I hope that's indisputable. But to undercut this very long priority, Canada consistently tries to characterize Indigenous peoples as immigrants too. And to support this claim, my favorite hate theory is the Bering Strait theory. It's invoked a lot, and you'd be surprised if you've never seen this. Just read some Tom Flanagan, just read some Barbara Kay, just read some Frances Widdowson. I mean, if you want to pull your hair out, they really do bring this up. So they talk about the Bering Strait theory as, as a path of migration. Therefore, Indigenous peoples are just migrants like everybody else. Despite the fact that, the Bering Strait theory has come under a lot of fire, there's more of like a multiple migration theory in place. The dates keep getting pushed back, how long we were here and stuff. But the fact is that Indigenous peoples may not be endemic to the Americas, meaning we're not only found here, but we are Indigenous to the Americas. We're the first people here. So it doesn't matter when that happened. It's simply a fact, right? So this isn't just mainstream confusion about this idea of like the Bering Strait and everybody being immigrants. It has at time been official policy to refer to Indigenous peoples as immigrants, particularly after the First World War. The Canadian citizenship branch was combined with Indian Affairs. I know it's a weird marriage there. Into a Department of Citizenship and Immigration. So it was like the ministry dealing with Indigenous people and then immigrants just like together, okay? And until 1966, official publications and programs referred explicitly to the Bering Strait theory, openly calling Indigenous peoples immigrants in order to foster that notion that everyone living in Canada came from somewhere else. But characterizing Indigenous people as immigrants is just one way that settler colonialism universalizes its own existence as a natural process that all human beings have engaged in. And, regardless of how the original humans came here, Eve Tuck and Wang Yang explain in their fantastic article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, that Indigenous peoples are those who have creation stories, not colonization stories, about how they came to be in a particular place. So just be on the lookout for these sorts of talking points, and ask like, why? Why are you bringing this up? Like, what is this about? And quite often it's about undercutting Indigenous claims. So if we think about colonization and settlement here from non-Indigenous peoples, we can sort of look at it like prairie grasses. So look at these gorgeous root systems, right? These are native grasses to the prairies. With extremely resilient root systems. This is how they're able to withstand, drought, forest fires, bison, like squishing them all the time, things like that. Okay? It sort of represents Indigenous priority. And then settlers are like Kentucky bluegrass, recent surface connections to land, lacking in the same resilience and adaptability to specific place that was developed over tens of thousands of years among Indigenous peoples. So that root system hasn't really been built yet, and yet Kentucky bluegrass is like taken over everything. So I think about non-Indigenous settlement really as a blip, and it's something that we're not really prepared to grapple with, because educationally we take this tiny little period of time and we stretch it out. Like we take years learning all about settlement and Canadian history, but there's all this history, thousands of years of history before that, that's the part that gets shortened and made tiny. So specific to this is looking at the Fraser River Basin area. You look at this is deep time. We're looking at just even the landscape, the age of the landscape. We've got the oldest skeleton recorded out there, 8,000 years, but we have evidence of human, interaction with the environment much longer than this. All of this stuff is going on for thousands of years, and then boom, settlement in Canada, and that's all we ever talk about. It's all we ever talk about. So I think one of the things that we really, really need to do is just stretch our brains out over that period of time a little more to put Canada into context. Because as I like to say, just because Canada has existed for as long as I've been alive, and as long as, multiple generations of people have been alive, it's still a teensy-weensy little part of our history, and Canada doesn't always have to exist, or it doesn't always have to exist in the way that it does. These things can, and they do change. It's just hard to conceive of within one human lifetime, or even a couple. And a couple of other more moves to innocence, and I'm getting close to the end here, I promise. These are important to talk about, because moves to innocence are motivated by a desire to absolve oneself of any responsibility to address white supremacist settler colonialism. So one way you can stop doing that is, again, don't internalize it. It's not an event. It's not something you did. It's a structure that you stepped into, and now you have inherited a responsibility to understand the structure and preferably like dismantle it. But here are some moves to innocence that Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang identify in that decolonization is not a metaphor, that we're seeing more and more. So settler nativism, okay, is locating a long lost ancestor, like literally in a lot of cases, like 400 years ago, one person out of like over 1,000 ancestors, one person who may or may not actually be Indigenous. And then this relies on blood quantum, this idea that like, if you have just one sacred, mystical Indigenous ancestor, that makes you Indigenous. Like, I think the rest of your ancestors would be like, what about us, right? So yeah, and blood quantum works really differently for white people versus Black people. So for Black folks, blood quantum has historically been applied according to the one drop rule to ensure slavability, right? And the one drop rule, when wielded by white people, allows them to remain white while claiming to be Indigenous, no matter how distant their supposed Indigenous ancestor is. And you might be like, but Chelsea, you're super white. Yes, my dad is super white. And yeah, but that's not my ancestry is not like 400 years ago. It's like my mom, my grandparents, like Métis marrying Métis, marrying Métis for many, many generations. So this isn't to say like, you know, you can't be a Black native or white native or whatever. We're not, it's not a race. Okay. We're a lot of different people. But if your connection to Indigenous communities goes back that far, then maybe rethink why you want to be making those claims. Settler adoption fantasies is kind of the same thing, but it's this idea that like, you know, your Cree friend gives you a pass, you know, you're one of us, or like, you know, you just somehow you've learned our traditions, maybe you speak the language and now you feel like you're super Indigenous, and that's but I think this one is the most important. So colonial equivocation is homogenizing experiences of oppression as colonization. So it's a trickier move to innocence because it operates by calling different groups colonized without describing their relationship to settler colonialism. And this, I think, really applies in Quebec. So Quebec has, and arguably still experiences, sort of colonial oppression from Anglo society. Okay, and there's, you know, whether it's Britain or Canada, you know, that is true. That's a true positionality, but it doesn't change the fact that Quebec continues to operate on stolen lands and continues to be in a colonizer position towards Indigenous people. So you can be more than one thing at once. You can experience more than one reality at once. You can be the oppressed and the oppressor at the same time. And that's something that I think we really, really need to start looking at. So you can even live in Canada because of external colonial pressure that Canada participates in. But your presence can feed into the settler colonial relationship, which requires ongoing claims to Indigenous lands and resources. I'm not saying there's a simple solution there. And I'm not saying like, oh, y'all have to move. It's not that at all. But once we start to look at that and be honest about it, then we sort of understand our relationship to that structure. And some people are benefiting within that structure more than others, obviously. But also just, you know, it's set up this way. It pits you against us. It pits you against other peoples. So how do we get out of that? And just, I'm going to rip through this because it's a little bit longer, but you know, these are some of the myths I address in Indigenous rights. The idea that Indigenous folks don't pay taxes, we get free housing, education, money, they just hand us money, and healthcare and all this stuff. But the fact is again, we're very inequitably being able to participate in the economy of this nation. We're not, you know, benefiting from the wealth that's being extracted from our lands. And even if this were true, even if this all were true, which it isn't, by the way, it still wouldn't be enough. It still wouldn't, it wouldn't put us on par with other like non-Indigenous Canadians who through tax, you know, monies are also getting these things, and the tax monies are because of the natural resources. There's this idea too that things are getting better for us because we're being included more in institutions. There's more Indigenous correctional officers, students, people in, you know, social workers, like, you know, we're everyone now. We're still really underrepresented and stuff like that. But our inclusion in these institutions has not benefited our communities. In fact, things are really bad for Indigenous peoples, worse than they were before. Like prior to the 1960s in Canada, Indigenous peoples only represented like 1 to 2% of the federal prison population. You know, now we're the majority. And especially like when you look specifically in certain provinces where we're a high population, it's shocking, okay? So yeah, these are just a couple of stats about that. And like, you know, prison is the new residential school. It's like where a lot of our people are. You know, you've still got 32 long-term drinking water advisories in 28 Indigenous communities. You know, some places have had like entire generations growing up without access to clean drinking water. And yeah, it's getting better, but is it? Because at any one time, there are about 100 water advisories in place in Indigenous communities. And so not all of them are long-term. And people on reserve are 90 times more likely to have no access to running water at all. So these stats are even kind of skewed in that direction. So I wouldn't say that that's getting better. You know, and then, you know, we think about our overrepresentation in the child welfare system. Again, even with all the inclusion that we have in our people in these institutions, it's getting considerably worse every year. It's quite scary. So I'm just going to sort of end with this because we're exactly at 4:30. I want to end off on a sort of like a more positive note. And I want to say that, like, you know, we know what the problems are. We really do. We know the issues and we know the solutions. And that's, you know, if you don't want to like listen to me about it, then go look at what Canada itself has researched. We have like the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996. There were 444 recommendations. Okay. Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the 94 calls to action. These are just like a few of the like thousands and thousands of pages of research out there that like really look at all of the ways that Canada interacts with Indigenous peoples, the kinds of things that arise because of those interactions, and how we can make them better. And the fact is that like we do the research and then we don't follow through. So it is really important, particularly for non-Indigenous people in this country, to be the ones to say, if we know what the problem is and how to solve it, then we require our governments to do that. Like, you've got to really hold them accountable. And then here are my like 3 principles to live by. So I think this really works if you want to be in allyship and solidarity with any marginalized group at all. You got to do 3 things, and they sound really simple, but they're not. So the first one is to believe communities when they talk about their own lived experiences. And you would think that would be a simple starting point, but it's one that we rarely actually get to, because everyone thinks they know better than a group who's experiencing oppression. You know, when you think about like people who are unhoused, you know, sometimes people go listen to them, but for the most part, folks are like, no, they don't really understand. They don't know what's going on. So let's just like stop that. Believe communities when they talk about their own experiences. Okay. 2, believe that communities have the solutions to the problems facing them. Yes, even if you think that, you know, they're miserable and everything's terrible for them, and, you know, and they're dealing with all these things, they still, as a community, they do have the solutions. So you have to listen to that. Don't think that you know what's best. And then the third part is putting that into action. Support communities in enacting the solutions that they've identified. And it's not glorious. It's not going to be you in the front lines getting all the photo ops. It might be washing the dishes, setting up childcare so folks can have meetings, you know, like shoveling the shit, you know, like whatever it is, the material support that folks need so that they can get things done. And that is what we need. Like, that is what Indigenous peoples need. We need folks to get educated, yes, but we don't want you to just sit there and like take your whole lifetime to get educated. Listen to us, believe us, and then support us, you know, be with us. And be willing to make mistakes, be willing to like get told, hey, you're doing it wrong, and be humble about it, and come back to that idea that settler colonialism is a structure, okay? It's not an event. And you as well are constrained in all sorts of ways within this structure. You have different power and access, but you can, once you recognize it, you know, start to do things about it. And this is how you do it. All right, so I'm going to stop there to open it up to questions.
Thank you, Chelsea. That was great. What we're going to do, folks, on Zoom is we're going to first turn to the students in this class for a couple of questions to Chelsea. And then once we've done a few from the students in this class, we'll open it up to the broader Zoom room. But in the meantime, if you want to start popping your questions in the chat, start to formulate them, we put them in there, and then we'll we'll curate those and then come to some of those when it's time. So back to this class here at Concordia, environmental assessment and Indigenous peoples. This is a course that students are all becoming environmental assessment professionals, Chelsea. Okay, so we have some questions from them that some are specific to environmental assessment, some are not. But I'm going to hand it over first to Ulrich to ask the first question that the students have come up with.
Hi, Chelsea. Thanks for that talk. It's really nice. I was wondering if there was one piece of advice you could offer settlers working in the environmental assessment field, what would it be?
Oh, that's a tough one. I guess this goes back to those three principles, right? Like, whatever, like it particularly if you're going to be working with Indigenous folks or, you know, within their territories, which is everywhere, right? But hopefully you're thinking about that, about partnering with Indigenous communities, is again, don't go in there and assume that you know what they need. Communities have, like a lot of our communities are really overtaxed in terms of just like the amount of capacity that we have to do things. So that doesn't mean that we can't do it, but rather that, you know, we have lots of plans. We have a lot of things that we want to get done. And if you come in and you say, hey, I've got these skills and this expertise, where do you want me? Okay. It might take a little bit of time because, you know, this is still an ask for labor. This is still asking a community to sit down and figure out where they can best use you. But chances are they already have a really good idea. So they can tell you, okay, we want you to do this. We want you to do that for us. And I think just like being able to take that direction and develop your plans, like co-constitute your plans with a community that you want to partner with, rather than come in with your own plan. That works really well. And I guess the other thing too would just be, you know, really, really deeply listen to what folks out on the land are saying. You know, one of the things that just still blows my mind is how infrequently, you know, sort of Canadian scientists listen to Indigenous knowledge or sort of discount the deep familiarity that folks have with the lands. Because I mean, like even within our languages, you know, I teach Cree, and we were just going over the names of the months, for example. And in Cree, the names of the months all have something to do with like a really important thing that is happening in the natural environment during that month. And so, you know, you have like frog moon, you have like flying up moon, you have mating moon, these kinds of things. But climate change has happened so rapidly that these descriptors no longer apply in all places. You know, and so that deep knowledge of the environment is embedded even in the language. And so when you speak to people who are out on the land, they can tell you so many things about what has changed. So yeah, just be humble, be optimistic, and be ready to follow the lead, because you'll be doing amazing work.
Thank you. Rachel, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hi, Chelsea. So we'd love to hear about some success stories about restoring Indigenous jurisdiction and land back.
One of the coolest things, and I'm gonna pull this up while I talk to you so I can drop it in the chat. One of the coolest things, in my opinion, because I come from a Buffalo people, that is happening right now is the Buffalo Treaty. So give me a second. Boom. All right, there, it's in the chat. So the Buffalo Treaty is sort of international diplomacy between Indigenous peoples on the plains. Some of us, like, you know, there's a lot of beef going back a long time, but these communities are coming together to rematriate bison into prairie lands. I don't know if you know, but like during the genocide of the buffalo, at a certain point, you know, they went down from millions to a herd of about 250, and some of that herd was actually in the possession of like white settlers. And so just growing these herds and then bringing them back like to the land, but also the Buffalo Treaty includes buffalo as a treaty partner. So there's a chair set aside for the buffalo, and that's not just symbolic. Like there are people who really deeply understand our relationships with bison, and so they bring that perspective in when they make decisions. And so this, to me, like they didn't wait for the Canadian state, they didn't wait for anybody. These were Indigenous nations just coming together saying, our youth need to see the buffalo back. Also, the buffalo have this like incredible relationship with their ecosystems. You know, there's so much that goes on when we bring buffalo back. And so to me, this sort of like international Indigenous diplomacy that's happening, you know, across the medicine line down in the States and in Canada is really really shows us what we can be doing when we don't spend all of our time trying to seek recognition from the state. We just work together to build capacity. We do beautiful things, and we do it in our way. We bring in elders, we bring in the youth, we bring in, you know, the animal nations, the plant nations, we bring in all of those considerations. So I think with, you know, there are amazing land back sort of initiatives happening all over the place. It's sort of like little dots here and there, and every single one of them is special and different in its own right. So I think, you know, anytime that you start to feel overwhelmed by any issue, right? Like it doesn't matter if like you're focusing on the environment or you're thinking about like particular social issues or, you know, whatever it is, whatever lens you're looking at sort of making the world a better place through. It's really important to understand that you're not alone. There are people out there doing the thing and often with a lot of experience that you can tap into. You never have to reinvent the wheel. You just got to go and like make those connections with people. So if you're interested in land back, I would say like look around what's happening. You know, almost certainly there's stuff happening around you. It might just be hard to find, and then tap into that and then see what people are doing elsewhere. And I think that there's such a place for folks who are in, you know, who are involved in climate justice to become part of land back because land back is really, it's not just about like, we want the resources back and we want to be able to exploit them just like you. It's also about bringing in those plant and animal nations and, you know, and restoring health to the lands that sustain all of us. So there's so many, but check out Briar Patch magazine also had some a really good focused issue on land back a while ago, and it's all online, so you can check that out for some more specific examples.
Wonderful. Okay, Claudia, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, so our next question, were there any topics that almost made it into your book, Indigenous Rights, but couldn't be kept in?
Yeah, originally I pitched like 63 chapters and they were like, nobody's gonna buy that. Yeah, so yeah, I didn't talk about murdered and missing Indigenous women and the long activism there. Oh gosh, there's so many things. Like I've actually do have a list on my phone of, you know, if I do a second edition of all the things else I have to cover. There's so much, right? People want to know about post-secondary funding. People want to know about like resurgence. They want to know about like language. They want to know about modern treaties and all this stuff, right? And the problem with that is like everything, like I said, a lot of things change very rapidly, but fundamentally the structure remains the same. So I have to like update, you know, some of the statistics and things like that, but generally the relationship hasn't shifted all that much. So yeah, there's a lot I want to include, but I don't think I could get it in there. So I'm probably going to have to just do like another volume. I don't know.
Sounds great. Claire, another question.
So our next question is a bit similar, but if you could write an update to the book, what would you include today?
One of the big things, so one thing, you know, you're always like unhappy with your own writing, but over the years, some of my opinions have changed a little bit. So at the beginning, I go into this big spiel about how I'm not going to call people white because it like, you know, turns them off and then they don't want to listen, and I don't care anymore. Because I think we need to have those discussions about white supremacy, and we have to name whiteness. And I think it's hilarious that honestly, Black Panther did so much for us in terms of being able to use terms like colonizer. Like it was like in the movie as a joke, but all of a sudden people were saying colonizer like unironically. And I was just like, because after a while, certain terms, like once you get comfortable with them, like settler for a lot of people, they've been hearing it long enough. They're like, yeah, okay, sure, I'm a settler. That's fine. But if it isn't actually making you think about your positionality, then you need to be discomfited a little bit. And I think that we can start to use other terms. Terms need to evolve. And yeah, I think some of the advice that I was getting at the time about like, let's not name whiteness, I just don't agree with anymore. So that's one thing. It's not that I would make the tone of the book any more sort of like adversarial, but just there's certain things that we need to talk about openly if we're going to understand those structures. And, you know, mostly it's like things that I want to say more. There's more things I want to write about. So it's not so much, you know, what would I include? Like I said, like 20, 30 more chapters of stuff. But with a focus too, I think on, you know, because part of the problem is like when you talk about this stuff, even if you don't want to, you sort of tend towards a deficit-based narrative of all the things that lack and all, you know, all the bad stuff that happens. And that is important information, but it can also feel a bit disempowering and also sort of reinforces stereotypes about Indigenous folks. So I think having a bit more there on resurgence and on the amazing things that we do and on our resilience, being rooted in Indigenous joy, not just like surviving, I think would bring another perspective in there that folks really need to understand about us. Like, it is not all woe is me. Like, we're dealing with a lot of trauma intergenerationally and ongoing, but the fact that our community still exists, the fact that we still have our languages and ceremonies, you know, in a lot of cases, you know, even with disruption, I think is a testament to just the fact that when things are rough, we take care of each other. You know, we don't become insular and violent and like oppositional. We really like pull people in to our kinship webs. And I think that is a blueprint for how we could be, you know, behaving in the future as well.
Fantastic. And we have one last question from here in the course here at Concordia. So I'll hand it over to Jolie to ask the last question.
Okay, so kind of back in the realm of environmental assessment, what are your thoughts on Indigenous-led environmental impact assessments? And how effective do you think environmental assessments are in addressing Indigenous people's concerns regarding development of projects?
Well, here's the problem, right? You can go out there and do really excellent research work, and you can come up with your reports on environmental impacts. And we're talking here usually about some sort of development, right? Usually an extractive development. So the idea is that there's this process now that Canada says, okay, well, we want to minimize disruption to the natural environment, but we still need to access these resources. And so you can put the research out there, you do everything, and it, you know, it says what you need it to say, and it really shows what you need it to show. But at the end of the day, it's not up to you whether or not that information is listened to. And this is something that we see again and again. And this is something I caution you about, because it can often lead to like people burning out in the field. Is that, you know, you go out there with all the best intentions, you develop good relationships with people and the lands, you put your heart and your soul into creating a report that you're hoping is going to help protect those people in those lands and those waters, and industry just like does what it needs to do and steamrolls over the whole thing anyway, you know. And so what was the use of all the work that you did, right? But I think what you need to do is expect that this is going to happen, because there are all sorts of legal workarounds for all of the protections that Canada supposedly puts in place. And that has been going on for a really long time. So it can even feel sometimes when you're working in these fields that you're somehow complicit because it happens anyway. So I need you to just steel yourself and realize that is a possibility that could happen to you and your work. But the information itself is super useful still. You know, if the community decides that it wants to put that information out into the wider sphere, it can be the basis for mobilization and solidarity with that group if they're opposing some sort of development that looks like it's going to go ahead anyway. You know, we do need those facts and those reports to like back up the action that happens. So I don't know, I just say this to everybody who's trying to do good in the world, is just be prepared for all the good you do to be ignored and for it to not work. But it doesn't mean that the work you're doing is not extremely valuable, right? So just build resilience within your sort of like your work ethic. And the best way to do that is just like be in relationship with people, right? When things get really sucky, just like go and talk to the people that you've built those relationships with, and they'll be like, yeah, that happened to the last people too. Like, but you know, let's just go chill for a while. Yeah.
Thank you, Chelsea. Next, I'm going to hand it to Shannon Chief, who is the co-instructor of this course. Shannon, who's here on Zoom, has a question for you.
Hi, Chelsea. It's really enjoying your book that class are reading through and so on. My question was, first of all, recently I had like a little meeting with some people that were doing like a justice project. And the Minister of Justice of Quebec recognizes that the things that they are doing with like Indigenous people that are facing like criminal charges, all these different things is not working. Like jail time's not working. Everything that they do in their system is not working. So do you think that you would ever consider like creating some kind of a volume book or a book that would guide so that people that are going into the justice, let's say, programs and all those things could understand a little bit more of what First Nations issues are and how they would approach it, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and this is where education truly is needed, and we're so far behind in a lot of cases. I don't know if you heard about this recently, but in Alberta, 51 members of the Alberta Law Society petitioned to have a mandatory professional development course dropped. And so this was a course that was specifically came about because of TRC recommendations. And it was to train legal professionals on sort of like the basics of Canada's relationship with Indigenous folks. And so these people didn't even want to do that. Like, and you know, it's easy to just click through and zone out and not even do this stuff, right? So it's not even like, we're not even to the point where we can have mandatory courses for people who are going into these fields as correctional services officers or as lawyers, judges, and things like that. There's still so much pushback and feeling of entitlement that they shouldn't have to learn these issues and like really openly hostile stuff. And just in that case, luckily, the Law Society had a special meeting where a record number of lawyers showed up and overwhelmingly voted against removing this requirement. But 868 lawyers in Alberta voted to get rid of it. You know, so I think that's a bit troublesome. So part of the problem is, again, we do actually know what the issues are. This has been studied so much. You have every single year, the Office of the Correctional Investigator, Ivan Zinger, puts out a report, and there's a huge chunk of it that just focuses on, and this is federal, right, not provincial, but these reports exist in the provinces and territories too. So he looks every year at the state of sort of Indigenous folks in correctional, like from their first interaction with a police officer to, you know, all the way through their sentencing, and looks at this every year and highlights the inequality, you know, in treatment and like what are the main issues, and then offers solutions. And he's been doing this for like 25 years. So we have reams and reams of information and really, really good recommendations. And every year he also puts out like a report card of how the government is done. And sometimes they implement some of the suggestions, but it's very few. They almost always get a failing mark. And one of the recommendations is this more education, right? But then because we're talking about legal societies that are sort of provincially and territorially based, every single one of those jurisdictions has to make the choice to either provide the education or not. So I feel like for me to put that information out there, it's not even needed. The information is there. What we need is for folks to, again, like push their elected leaders to say this needs to be a requirement. Like when I went through law school from 2006 to 2009, there was no mandatory course on Indigenous issues at all. Like there's nothing, right? And most law schools, there still isn't. So folks can go into these fields not knowing about any of the systemic discrimination, and then they just continue to perpetuate it. So this is one of many issues where we really, really know what the problems are. It's very well researched. We know what the solutions are. And now we have to pressure our politicians to actually do something about it. So it's super frustrating. It's super frustrating because it's really, really getting worse. But you can see the resistance to being forced to learn any of this. We have to break through that somehow.
Thank you, Chelsea, and thanks for that question, Shannon. There's a question in the chat that was sent to me directly, Chelsea, that I'll read out. It's an anonymous question, and it's as follows. Given that settler colonialism is a structure that one enters into, which implies willingness to migrate to the state, how would you characterize those whose ancestors descended from enslavement and indenture processes where there was a lack of consent to migrate, how do they fit into the definition of settler? And if so, how? Or do they fit in and how? If not, what term do you think would be most suitable?
Okay, so the thing here is settler colonialism being a structure, not an event, doesn't actually imply any sort of consent to come here, right? It doesn't matter about how you come here. You're still coming into the structure. Does that make you a settler though? Not always. I disagree with some folks on this. I don't think the binary gives us enough information, you know, whether we're looking at Indigenous versus non-Indigenous or Indigenous versus settler. It's a starting point. It's a starting point. When we talk about settlers, we're sort of putting at the center Indigenous perspective. So that's an important step. But then absolutely, we need to talk about the different ways that people enter in or are brought into these structures. So settler colonialism itself is, you know, I said that it's founded on white supremacy. It's founded on sort of the dispossession of Indigenous peoples. It's also very much founded on the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade preceded colonization of the Americas and made the colonization of the Americas possible. These two things were co-constituted. The papal bulls that enabled Europeans to go and turn people into property also told them that it was fine to take the lands and resources of anybody who was a non-Christian. So these things are not separate. These things happened at the same time, and they underpin all of the relationships we've had since. So for me, and I say this in the book, and I've said this elsewhere, I don't think it's appropriate to call the descendants of enslaved peoples settlers, because that suggests that sort of everybody came in the same playing field, you know, like it completely ignores that history, right? So what do we call people? Well, this is the thing, is there's no good terms for everybody, and terms are going to change. So when people ask me this, I'm always cautious, because I want to know, why do you want to know? Like, why do you want to know how you cannot be called a settler, right? Is it so that you can more accurately describe your relationship with the settler state? If so, great, you know, and you know, there's lots of people working on this. But if it's so that you can sort of elide your responsibility to address the structure, then that's a problem. And I think right there too in the question, conflating enslaved peoples with indentured like workers is also problematic, right? Because, you know, a lot of folks want to talk about how their ancestors, and this is usually how it comes about, how their ancestors came here from Ireland or Scotland and things like that. And again, this goes back to the fact that you can be a colonized people who are also part of the colonization project yourself. You can have those two positionalities yourself. So I think it is very, very important that we talk about the ways in which even ongoing Canadian involvement in sort of imperialist actions all over the world create conditions where people are forced to leave their homes or are dispossessed and end up in Canada, right? These people are not coming in with the same access to the structure. They're not going to benefit from it in the same way, but that structure is still happening at the expense of Indigenous sovereignty on our lands, right? So how do we deal with that? It's not necessarily going to be through terms that we agree on that are going to like help us really understand, because those terms are not really going to help us understand. We have to like really dig down deep to get a view of that structure and keep the eye on the structure. Because again, the thing about terms is it brings it back to the individual. What am I? Who am I? Instead of what is my relationship to the settler state, right? And that is your relationship right now, regardless of what else is going on. What can you do? Because at the end of the day, this isn't about like assigning guilt and less guilt. It's about making a world that is better for everyone, because the system that we're living in under extractive, ruinous capitalism is not working for anyone. Even the folks who are benefiting the most, who are getting the richest, they're still poisoning the planet. You know, they're still ruining it for themselves. Like, I don't care if they think they're going to go to Mars and get away from it. We're all living on this planet together. So, you know, making a better life means getting off our asses and fixing stuff, you know, and maybe that means like dismantling systems that can't be reformed. And I got to say, when it comes to settler colonialism and the colonial state, I don't think that's a system that can be reformed. We just got to like do something else.
Okay. Excellent. Chelsea, there's a couple people with hands up. Are you open to people on Zoom unmuting themselves and asking the question directly?
Sure.
Okay. Go ahead, Carol, and then Kevin after that.
I'm clicking on the wrong microphone there. Hi, my name is Carol Buber-Blodgett, and I belong to the Defined Out of Existence Band of the Penobscot people. I am also Hunka Lakota, Sinakanju Lakota, which means that I have gone through the making a relative ceremony to become a family member. It's often called adoption, but that's not a good term to describe that. So I kind of wanted to touch base about what it means to be defined out of existence. And because of the colonial system and the blood quantum rules that were put into place here in the United States, my relatives fled from Canada into Maine with their children because they were taking all the children and putting them in boarding schools. And they were a mixed family. And so to hide the heritage, they moved across the border and settled in Linneus, Maine. And the only name I have from my great grandmother is Mary, because that's the name she was given in the boarding school. In the Bible, she's listed as Mary Penobscot. And then but there's no native name. So because the Penobscots use blood quantum, I can never prove that lineage. And so I can never be an official member of the tribe. My biggest challenge, because I was raised to believe that I was white, I was 35 before I found the family Bible and found out true history, has been my decolonization of myself. And so I want people to understand that that decolonization has to happen within Indigenous peoples too. There are some of us who are so colonized because of the colonial system that we didn't have an option. If you were put in a boarding school, there's a certain amount of colonization that you have to pull out of yourself. And I'm still at 74, I'm still working on it. And you know, it's going to be a long, hard challenge. And so I want you to know that we do understand, or you know, that it's not hard, that it's not easy. And that some of us, even though we may have Native heritage, may have had to undergo personal decolonization ourselves. And so I just wanted to put that out and get some ideas from the rest of you. Thank you for listening.
Chelsea, would you have any responses to Carol's intervention there?
No, I don't think there was a question there, so I think I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, Kevin, do you have a quick question for Chelsea?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. In my learning about the two-row, my question is directly related to my relationship with the two-row. I'm a grandson of post-war migrants. My grandmothers were from Holland and from England, and I was lucky to be raised alongside Mohawk Tyendinaga territory. So I am now in my process of learning in as much as I can and sharing what I'm learning with others. Now, what I want to know is in direct relation to the two-row wampum, if I see that my vessel by our leaders are directly, purposely careening towards the canoe, do I not have a responsibility to stop that, to step in front of the vessel, to stop that accident from happening? And if you could speak to that, that'd be great. And just quickly, I'll say I'm also in the process of looking at this as a global context, not just where I live, but in every watershed. There are other subjects to the crown in other parts of the world that potentially, if we teach them that there is an agreement between the crown and the Haudenosaunee, that they themselves also can use the two-row wampum to defend, if not speak to their responsibility, although they're not even in this continent, to be able to stand up in the continent where they are against the crown, because the crown is purposely making this happen in Turtle Island. Thank you.
So one thing I would say too is that, you know, the two-row wampum and specifically the history of the Haudenosaunee and their relationships to, like, you know, the Dutch and then later on the British Crown, you know, that's a very specific circumstance. And I do hesitate about overgeneralizing some of the ideas that we can take from the two-row wampum to other contexts outside of Haudenosaunee territory, because the Haudenosaunee have an unbroken line of laws and diplomacy for over 1,000 years. So they really do understand sort of their context and how this needs to be applied. So, and just one more caveat there, I would say that when it comes to wanting to live according to the principles of the two-row wampum, it's really, really important to not turn it into a metaphor and speak directly to folks in governance who understand what they want that to be, right? Okay, but going back to the idea, and for those who don't know, the two-row wampum is, you know, in terms of like the wampum belt itself, the general principle is that settler administrators should not be interfering with Indigenous sovereignty. You know, we can go along on these lands side by side, but we shouldn't be veering in or putting ourselves in the other canoe and taking over. And absolutely, Canada has continued, just like all colonial powers has continued to sort of be the one who wants to careen into the canoe or be the one in charge. So whether or not you decide that your responsibility to address that overstepping into Indigenous sovereignty, whether you want to do that through the two-row wampum, whether you want to do that as somebody who is in historic treaty areas such as Treaty 6 or Treaty 8 or any of the various treaties, and use that as a basis, say, you know, I'm a treaty person, and therefore it's my responsibility to make sure that the Canadian state and the Crown continues to be a good treaty partner. Or if you're in areas where there is no treaty, and so there's no like kind of Indigenous formal Indigenous relationship with the state that can guide you, then there I think you also just need to look at whether, you know, just look at Indigenous sovereignty itself as something that you can support in any way that you can. So yeah, like you can use whatever argument or sort of like you know, specific geographic agreement in place to bolster your action. But I would hope that people would do that regardless, you know, wherever they are. So yeah, it's.
Okay. So, sorry, unmuted the second computer. So there was a question previously in the chat that I'll raise here, and then there's more people online who want to ask a question. Please put it in the chat, and we'll look at them from there. Michael asked earlier, says, as a Métis person, I often feel that we are secondary to First Nations and Inuit Indigenous peoples. We are always listed last when discussing indigeneity. Any suggestions for ways in which we can elevate our position?
So I think the problem is that there's a lot of misinformation out there about who Métis are, because Métis, as you know, coming from a French word, means mixed. And so folks assume that mixed Indigenous peoples are Métis. And it has been really difficult to assert our peoplehood as a specific, you know, Indigenous people. And part of it too is just because of that administrative category that exists. So the way that the Canadian state chose to deal with Métis was to ostensibly extinguish our Aboriginal rights through scrip by giving us fee simple land on our own land. Here's some land that you already had, but whatever. And the purpose there was like, okay, you're not our problem anymore. We gave you land. What you do with it is your problem. And the way that they dealt with First Nations was different, to create the reserve, you know, and to really micromanage every aspect of their lives through the Indian agent. And so people see these administrative differences and think that they're real differences that say something about who we are. But the fact is that if we didn't have to make the political choices that we did to be included in the Constitution, the reality of Métis is that we are an Indigenous people just like the Cree or the Anishinaabe or the Dene are. We're not really any different. You know, I mean, culturally, yes, in terms of like our specific history, and that's true of all, you know, First Nations and Inuit peoples. We have those specificities, but there's nothing really different about us that means we should be a different category. And the reason that we're different categories is because of the difference in administration and the political decisions that we had to make to just like be noticed at all in the Constitution. And none of that nuance comes forth when people are talking about who we are. And, you know, so there's this really racialized understanding of who the Métis are that makes it very difficult. And you know, I don't know, I've been talking about this for years and it's still, and I teach this stuff and every year I still have to be like, no, Métis does not mean mixed. We talked about this in class, you know? So I don't know what it's going to take, but you know, I don't spend a lot of time feeling inferior. It's, you know, it's not something that we need to worry about. Like, let's spend time focusing on our community and our relationships with other Indigenous peoples and like living that good way and not worry about, you know, whether we're named first or last or whatever. Because over here, you know, it's the same. I'm in the middle of like Treaty 6 territory. I'm in the Métis homeland. And I still go and there's these territorial acknowledgements that are like, we're all on Treaty 6 territory, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, and the Métis homeland, like we get left out a lot, but like, that doesn't change how I'm gonna like live my life. I'm still gonna go to my community. I'm still gonna do things. I'm still gonna hang around with my Nekiowak and my Nakota friends and, you know, do stuff that doesn't involve getting recognition from the state. So I think we have to be very cautious about feeling any sort of way and thinking that that's something we need to overcome, because the fact is that the Canadian state wants to pit us against each other. It wants us to duke it out and be like, oh, First Nations get this and Métis don't get that, and Inuit get this and we don't get that. Like that's not a good way to go. We have to like work on things together and stick it to the state instead of letting them stick it to us.
Thanks, Chelsea. I think what I'm gonna do now is we have about 20 minutes left, so I'm gonna pass it to both of my colleagues, Jacqueline and Marcia, who maybe are gonna each ask one question. Maybe Marcia, calling you first.
Muted. Chelsea, am I still muted? Can you hear me? Okay. Chelsea, can you comment on what you think about the rise of the Eastern Métis folks and the pretendians we've been hearing about so much in academic spaces? Maybe that's a whole nother topic for a different event, but love to hear what you have to say about that.
I'm just like looking for my copy of Distorted Descent. Here we go. Okay, so a fantastic resource here is Daryl LaRue's book, Distorted Descent, White Claims to Indigenous Identity. So yeah, this is the thing is part of the problem is that this goes back to those settler moves to innocence that Tuck and Yang talk about, right? So like, why do people want to do this? For the most part, it's because people want to sort of recreate themselves as Indigenous, not to like claim relationality or any sort of like responsibility, but rather I think to elide the bad feelings that come when we start talking about colonization, right? Nobody wants to feel like a bad person. And when you start to look at the history of this country, it's really hard not to feel that guilt. And guilt is a really not a particularly good feeling to just like land on. And folks want to get away from feeling guilty or feeling shame. And so one of the ways that you can do that is say, well, I'm Native too. I'm off the hook. It's not me. It's not me. I don't have to do anything. And so before I even talk about like the Eastern Métis phenomenon, I just want to say like, there is no amount of like indigeneity that gets you off the hook. You know, like whether you're like, you know, you've never mixed with anybody, all of your parents are like Cree down to like, you know, creation, you're still living in this society and you still have to deal with it. Like Indigenous peoples, we don't get to choose to just be like, nah, not my problem because I'm not a settler. No, we have to deal with it because it impacts our lives. So even if folks are coming to this in a good way and they're discovering that somebody in their family was Native, rather than like becoming the spokesperson, the most Native person ever, and then like not really doing much about it, I think that that should be another reminder that you have a responsibility as a human being on these lands to do better, to undo these really, really destructive, you know, sort of oppressions that exist. So how do I feel about it? It feels shitty because these folks are going out there acting wild and making us look bad. And so in territories where Métis are not particularly populous, so I'm thinking about the Maritimes here, you know, there's not actually historic Métis communities out there. And don't argue with me on this, like, you know, and so we had folks out there who were opposing land claims that, like, long-term land claims that are going on among Mi'kmaq and Maliseet out there, poking their noses in and disrupting things that have like taken generations to set up, calling themselves Métis. And so I totally don't blame them, but I remember getting calls from folks that I used to work with in Listuguj, being like, what are y'all doing out here? And I was like, that's not us. I swear to God, it's not us. And they're like, well, they say they're you. So, like, you know, we would like to talk to Métis, and, you know, why are you doing this? And so it was some damage. You know, we actually had to do some damage control. Various groups of Métis had to actually travel out and speak to people in First Nations that were, you know, getting a little heated about this and be like, I swear to God, this isn't us. So yeah, I'm a little annoyed by that because I don't want to police people's identity. I think that's disgusting. One of the biggest things that I get asked to do all the time is to like verify whether or not somebody's Indigenous. And I'm just like, no. But I feel like then I have a responsibility to our First Nations relatives who are having these things happen in our name. Then as Métis, we have to do something about it. And we're seeing it more and more. So one of the things that's so interesting about this research is that he found a number of the groups that are now sort of like Eastern Métis groups started off as white supremacist groups who were specifically organized around opposing land claims. So these same people, and you know, maybe folks joining now don't know about that history, but these same people figured out that they weren't getting much traction. So rebranding themselves as Métis and calling themselves constitutional rights-bearing communities meant that to, you know, even uneducated government officials, suddenly they were able to poke their noses in and disrupt these sorts of like negotiations that have been ongoing for literally generations. And he talks about some of the ways that people do this, and it's wild. It's wild. But yeah, I don't like it. I have had people harass me at work. I've had death threats. I have had, you know, just people stalk me when I was living in Montreal, in the name of, like, you know, by saying that I'm being super laterally violent by denying these communities. And I just got to say, like, we don't know you. We're not related to you. Stop saying that you're us. And then there's all this quibbling. Well, Métis means mixed, so any of us can call ourselves that. You call yourself something different if you don't want to be associated with us. But the fact is, Métis in the Constitution, it was us who got us there. We're not going to change that name, even if we call ourselves different things in our own languages. It's just, I'm sick of it. I'm so sick of it. And I just want people to stop. Like, just be a good person. Like, please.
Thank you for that very clear answer. And thank you for the good question, Marcia. Jacqueline, want to ask a question?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for this brilliant and very rapid-paced overview of the myths and debunking them. That was really, really fascinating. My question is about how other movement spaces can I guess, journey with understanding settler colonialism and translate that into their movement work. So I'm thinking about movement spaces like the environmental movement or racial justice movements that aren't necessarily squarely centered on decolonization, but are allied movements and that want to work in service of decolonization. Yeah, curious to hear your thoughts on what it might look like for those allied movements to practice allyship.
All right, so I think one of the first things is I kept referencing decolonization is not a metaphor, which I'm going to pop into the chat there. So it's free, PDF is there. But I think that what is so important about this piece is it talks about, so it says, okay, decolonization is not a metaphor for all the other social justice work that is going on. That work's important, but it's not necessarily decolonization. Decolonization absolutely has to be centered on the return of Indigenous lands and sovereignties. So if folks want to be in allyship. So whether they're working in environmental justice or this and that, and they say, okay, well, we want to bring in, we want to decolonize. That's not happening if they're not explicitly addressing Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous land return. So, you know, that period, that's it, right? And so I think a lot, this goes back to the issue that a lot of people see this as like Indigenous issues are over here. They're like, there's something separate, but Indigenous issues are everybody's issue. They're not just for Indigenous peoples. So whatever movement you have on these lands has to address the relationship between those movements and Indigenous peoples. And honestly, like some of the environmental movements are so out of touch and doing so much harm in our communities. And just in terms of like a really great resource to check up on that, I'd say watch the film Angry Inuk. Angry Inuk sort of looks at the way in which the animal rights movement has specifically and continues to harm Inuit communities by misrepresenting the way in which Inuit participate in the seal trade, in the seal hunt, by sort of making this sort of Inuit personal use exception and not recognizing that Inuit rely on the commercial seal hunt, and that the way that the hunt is sort of talked about is specifically there to raise money for environmental movements. It's not there to actually do any good work. So I think folks have to understand that like it can be really I think intimidating to be like, okay, I'm really like invested in the environment. I'm really invested in like, you know, abolition and stuff like that. And you want me to learn all about this Indigenous stuff? Like, come on, I can only learn so much. But honestly, like your work is not decolonization if you're not dealing with that stuff. And I'm really like, decolonization as a metaphor is annoying enough, but now it's reconciliation. Reconciliation is the new metaphor for not doing shit to actually help Indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, Jacqueline, for that question. Now I'm going to hand it over to Alana, who Alana actually has a question, and she is a master's student here in the geography department, and she's going to ask a question now.
Hi, thank you. Good evening. Hi, classmates from another class, and thank you, Jen, and thank you for tonight, Chelsea. My question, I tried to formulate something that made sense, and hopefully you understand it. And if not, please ask. Because I'm looking at, you know, I think it's important that as students and researchers that we properly acknowledge, cite, reference Indigenous knowledge keepers in our writings and in our research documents. How would you suggest that we as students and also researchers, or well, anybody, I guess, anybody who is citing Indigenous people, how do we cite them, especially like, you know, to try to to eliminate like a form of biopiracy, right? Like you can't take their knowledge and make it yours. It's already somebody's. So how do you cite, or what is a good citing formula for a document? I hope that was clear.
Yeah, totally. And somebody who's, you know, there's a lot of really great Indigenous librarians actually who are working on this issue, because some of this is just is an issue of legibility. Like how do you cite oral history? How do you cite collective knowledge? How do you cite sacred knowledge, etc.? And one of the starting points, I think, would be Greg Younging's Elements of Indigenous Style is a really, really fantastic book. So it's a guide to for writing by and about Indigenous peoples. And so it's more than just a style guide. It's got the style guide. So like, you know, always capitalize Indigenous. It's an adjective. It's never like the Indigenous, stuff like that. Terms to avoid, you know, the preference, you know, for using people's endonyms, the names they call themselves. But what it also has that I think is really cool, and I don't think enough people read this because they think it's just a style guide, talks about a history of the portrayal of Indigenous peoples in literature, contemporary Indigenous cultural realities, cultural rights of Indigenous peoples, and things like that, right? So it's talking about that, like what are the collective rights of Indigenous peoples to their own knowledges. And so what I've seen recently, and I'll drop a link here, is the various style guides, so APA, Chicago, MLA, and stuff like that, are starting to realize, oh, we got to deal with this. And they all recommend this style guide. And then they're coming up with specific citation styles for things like, in-text citation, for personal communication, oral history, and stuff like that. Because within our own nations, we've always had a very strong citation style. Like when somebody tells a story within our cultures, they're almost always explaining exactly who told them that story, what was the context, sometimes who told that person that story. Like you can see the lineage of the story so that and there are all these amazing, beautiful rhetorical devices in our languages that highlight the fallibility of human memory. And so like, there's ways to like very quickly increase, say, this is how I remember it, like ESSA, like these small little things that you say, any mistakes I'm making are my own and not the person who told them to me. And so I think that's really beautiful. And so I think what we're seeing is the questions that you're asking are getting asked more widely. Is it perfect yet? No. But I would also, if you're on TikTok at all, I would suggest following Jessie Lawyer, who's a cousin of mine. I'm just going to find her on TikTok. But yeah, she talks about that a lot, about, here we go, Indigenous librarian. Let's make sure it doesn't like start talking. Okay. So she talks specifically about some of this stuff, and it's really, really awesome. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Alana, for the question. So we're at 5 minutes till the end. And Chelsea, I would love to ask a question. So back in 2015, you gave an amazing workshop to a bunch of environmental organizations here in Montreal, a bunch of Quebec environmental organizations. I don't know if you remember, but
I do.
Yeah. Do you remember when I think I asked you there? And this has been very, like, I think about this weekly, I think. It's been very, made a huge impression on me and transformed the way I think about things. But at the time I asked you, what do you think is one of the most annoying things Indigenous people find about working with environmentalists? And you said at the time, the concept of the environment. And just for the benefit of the students here studying environmental assessment, I'm wondering if you could share some of your thoughts about, how settlers, now Indigenous folks, understand the concept of the environment differently.
Oh, heck yeah. So part of the problem here is yes, that concept of the environment, sort of the colonial construction of the environment is really, really fascinating and something you should definitely look into if you haven't. So a lot of this hinges on the idea of wilderness versus land that has been tamed or like worked in some way. And so Indigenous peoples are often characterized as living with nature. So, we're like the butterflies and the little bunnies, and, we're like running through the land, and, we're one with nature and stuff. And to a certain extent, that's true, but also this discounts the fact that all human beings, including Indigenous peoples, very heavily modify their own environments. So there is actually no dichotomy in this country that exists that really fits into that binary of like, wild or like untamed and like all this stuff. So you think about like on the West Coast, for example, if you don't know what you're looking for, you don't see the signs of millennia of human interaction and manipulation of the environment. But on the West Coast, for example, you'll see there are cedar trees that folks back in the day would cut huge planks out of, right, without killing the tree. And so they would use those planks to build their longhouses. And so the tree just goes on. So if you don't know what that is, you don't know what's happening, right? But that's modification. On the prairies, burning the grass was a really common thing to prevent wildfires. Another thing that we did that I would love for us to bring back is some of the nations out here had essentially a treaty with the beaver, because beaver on the prairies are so essential for creating watersheds that prevent really intense fires from happening. So like nowadays, farmers will like literally use dynamite to blow up their lodges. But when beavers come along and they sort of dam up streams and stuff like that, it doesn't just create like a little pond. It creates an entirely resilient area around there for a long time that stops wildfires. So, for a long time before the fur trade, folks were not hunting beavers as much, right? And so that became really disrupted once the fur trade happened. So I think just like challenging the notion of what it means to be a conservationist, because one of the things that we see again and again in our history is that Indigenous peoples have been removed from places in order to like create national parks, like the Jasper National Park. You had a group of Métis, you know, you had Cree bands out there, you had Nakota, all of them were kicked out of that area so that you could create this pristine park where you're not allowed to like do human stuff in outside of the bounds of you know, what's allowed in a park. So this idea that like that our way of being environmental or should be that we just don't touch anything is actually really harmful, not just to humans, but also to the environment. It's harmful to the plants and animals that also are integrated into this web of relationships with human beings. And so the fact that that's been so disrupted, you know, really shows why some of the more intense environmental catastrophes that we've been experiencing are happening. Like another thing that I really love to think about is like, you know, it's this idea too that animals just live, you know, in nature and they're not doing it. But I think about there's this one forest in BC that is in heavy decline right now because for millennia during the salmon run, bears would go and just gorge themselves and throw the carcass. You know, it's like when you have so much food, you take a bite of the best piece and you throw the rest away. So they're doing that and they're throwing these salmon carcasses into the forest. And that created like a nutrient rich area for thousands of years that allowed this forest to grow. And because the salmon are in decline and the bears aren't able to gorge themselves in that way, the forest is also declining, and all of the other beings that require you know, that forest to like provide for them are also in decline. So that these webs that we do know about when we talk about the environment, we always sort of like hold ourselves outside of them. You know, humans are over here, but we're not, right? We're not. And it doesn't mean that we don't touch anything. It just means that we have to do it in a way that's sustainable and recognizes the impact that we have on all the other beings that exist out there. So yeah, that's one thing I'd really like to get through to a lot of environmentalists.
Thank you so much. That was, I really appreciate that perspective. I feel like it's really super important to so many things these days. So that we're at 7:31. So I'm gonna close this up here. I'd like to thank all the attendees for showing up. I'd like to thank the students in class. I'd like to thank Jacqueline from the hub and Marcia from Research for the Front Lines. I'd like to thank the students of this class for all the attentive reading of this book all semester and for your good questions tonight. And I'd like to thank Shannon, my co-instructor, for teaching this course with me and for being here tonight. And of course, thank you, Chelsea, so much for this amazing talk. Really, really, really insightful, really helpful. But thank you also for all the work you've done. For example, writing this book that is being read all over the country and really making a big difference. And it's an amazing resource for settlers to start the road of self-education. So thanks for doing the hard labor of getting that book out and all the rest of the things you're doing. And yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, Kinenasquamit and Wamas to for everybody for listening to me rant and ramble for so long.
Yeah, let's do it again sometime. Thank you so much. Bye. Take care, everyone. And the recording will be online on the Hub website and the Research for the Front Lines website. Bye.